Today what I'm going to talk about is the multilingual external module and field embedding. So the multilingual external module allows you to create fields with multiple languages. So instead of you having to create multiple surveys, one in each language, and having to collate that data down the road because you have, however many languages you have, that's how many copies of the field you have. What the multilingual allows you to do is consolidate all that into one group of fields and then just toggle the labels and the values into the languages that you select. So here in this project, this demo, I just have English and Spanish. And so if I click Spanish, all the labels change and the values change. This one doesn't change just because it doesn't have a translation. So these are all set with JavaScript. So if I go into the designer and I click, so you have to have this language field, and we have a video on the multilingual demo, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about how to set it up and everything, but just to show you. So let me go to the colors here because that has the most. What you do is when you have the multilingual module, it allows you to put in whatever languages you selected or whatever you've put in here, as the languages. It gives you those options. And then it asks you, what do you want those values to be when I click on that button and toggle between. So I have to give it a value for the question in English and Spanish, and then also for all of the answers in English and Spanish. Now, I've had to deal with this with Shazam because when we do Shazam, Shazam allows you to pull in the label of the field, but whenever you do the multilingual, it doesn't toggle back and forth. So I had to come up with a solution to code using JavaScript to mimic that functionality. And now that field embedding is in REDCap, and it's so much easier to build complex layouts using field embedding, but we have the same problem, is that you can't, with field embedding, you can't pass the field label to it. You have to manually type it in. But because you manually type it in, it doesn't work with the multilingual module, and I'll show you that real quick. So I created a little table already, and I'm just going to pop it in here in this field embedding field. So this is just, the name. Do you live in Arizona? Pick your favorite colors. This is just a quick example layout of what I'm talking about. So if I click on that, now we have this and these fields are embedded. If I go to add a record, now you see when I click English and Spanish, so if I click Spanish, none of these labels change. Now, the interesting thing with the field embedding is that drop-down lists and radio buttons do change, but checkboxes don't. So when I use the field embedding, I lose the ability to toggle between the languages with checkboxes and the labels. And anything that's not in field embedding that you already have the translations for will toggle back and forth. So now I'm just going to talk to you about doing the field embedding with the multilingual, and I haven't quite figured out how to get the checkboxes to work properly because the same trick that I use for the field labels for some reason doesn't work with the checkboxes. So here's a survey that I created for this diabetes prevention program, and if I toggle between Spanish and English, you see the image changes. That's because I'm using the same trick to change the image. There's two images that one gets shown and one gets hidden. And I have those hosted on a website somewhere that it just pulls those separate images in. And you'll see here that the radio buttons change, but the checkboxes, the way I got around it is I just have the Spanish showing all the time. So if I go back to English and go back to Spanish, you'll see that those checkbox values don't change. Same down here. So let me show you what I did. I used what's called the REDCap JavaScript injector. So in Shazam, if we look at Shazam real quick, Actually, there's no Shazam on here. I don't have any Shazam. I'm not using it. But in Shazam, when you have this editor open, it gives you a tab for HTML, which is where you'd put all your HTML. And then it has another one for CSS, which is where you'd put all your styles. And then there's another tab for JavaScript. So when I use Shazam, the JavaScript editor is right there, so I can put JavaScript in it automatically. But if I'm not using Shazam, which I'm not, so I'm just going to disable this here. There's no reason for it. I still need to get access to a JavaScript editor and be able to inject JavaScript into my project. So the nice thing is that there is an external module called the REDCap JavaScript injector. So if I go into the JavaScript injector configuration, I enable it, and then I get to tell it where I want this JavaScript to work on. And I can do it on the home page, the dashboard, only on the add edit records, the record home page, surveys, data entry pages, or both, or all project pages. And then, so I have it on the surveys and the data entry pages, and I have it only for this form. So I get to pick specifically what form I want. If I leave it blank, it'll apply to all the forms. And then I add my JavaScript code. Now I can add up here, if I click the plus sign, it gives me a whole nother set of these values. So I can have JavaScript code that's very specific to a certain survey or a certain form. And then I can also have other code that runs kind of globally in the project. It just depends on how complicated you want to get. So let me show you my JavaScript code and how I did this in with the field embedding. So the code is hard to see in this window, so I'm going to open it up in a separate page. But before that, I'm going to show you how I designed the field embedding. So with the field embedding, you can see here that I have the labels, they're blue. I have to hard code those. So every field that I want to be brought in, I have to give it a label. And with the multilingual, I have to provide the translation myself. So in the editor here, you can see that for one table data row, I have a span here with a class of language_1. And that span is the label that you're seeing, first name. And then I have another span that's called language_2, and I have a style that's display as none. So it's there, but I'm hiding it, and that's the Spanish. Now, the trick with the JavaScript is toggling back and forth between these two spans. So when English is selected as the language, I want anything that has a class of language1 to appear. And then if Spanish is selected, I want anything with a class of language2 to appear. And so I have to set the default for language2 to be none, or else they both show up until you click one or the other. So I'm doing that on every label that you see here. And so if I go, this is just an easier way to see this JavaScript. And you can see here, I just have a little snippet of the HTML for you to see. You can see here that the first name is language1, and then here the last name is language1, and then, same thing. Language2 has the Spanish, and language2 here has the Spanish translations. And so this is the JavaScript. And basically what I'm doing is there's a button on the survey. So if we go back to the survey real quick, this button up here is what you use to toggle back and forth. And what I'm doing is I'm grabbing this button, the value of this button, and I'm hooking the JavaScript code to the on-click action for this button. So anytime this button is clicked, I'm having this code fire. So I'm saying, and this is kind of counterintuitive, because I'm saying that if the inner HTML, the button equals Spanish, which it's not really the button that you're seeing, but it's the value of the HTML that's in the background. it's, you know, you think that it would be, well, if the button says English, I want English to show, but really it's kind of the opposite, because for some reason the English is showing, but the Spanish is set in the background. It's kind of weird. And so what I'm saying is, when this equals Spanish, which means I really want English, I want language 1, anything with a class of language 1 to show, and anything with a class of language 2 to hide. And then if it equals English, I want anything with language 1 to hide and language 2 to show, if that makes sense. So if we open up there's a inspect development tool in REDCap, or sorry, in Chrome, and you can see here that this language, this div ID of changeling, which is the ID that I'm grabbing in my code, when I click on this, it changes from English to Spanish. Now, I think that, I'm not sure exactly how this is being fired. I haven't looked, but if we go into and find change language, you'll see that's the code I've created. And you'll see here, this is in the multilingual functionality. So when you enable an external module, it injects its functionality in there. So I haven't gone through a lot of this, but this is where the code is being fired for this button for English and Spanish. So I'm not exactly sure why it's opposite, that if it shows Spanish, it's actually hiding or if I'm saying hide the Spanish when the button is Spanish, you know, so I don't know, but it works. I haven't tried it with 3 languages, so I'm not sure exactly how it would be if you had more than 2 languages. Actually, I take that back. I did do one with the REDCap project. Originally, they wanted English, Hebrew, and Arabic, and so I had to have 3 languages, but then they pulled it out and they just wanted the 2. So this is what you would use to mimic the multilingual functionality when you use the field embedding. Now, this form also has, so if I just submit this, the next form that they have is just pure multilingual. These are just fields and they're radio buttons, and so they follow the rules of the multilingual. They work with the multilingual. I didn't have to do anything for this, so it toggles back and forth. It's only when you do the field embedding that you have this problem of having to manually do the labels yourself. And so if this is something that somebody is interested in, I can always email them this little chunk of code here just to explain how to do that. And then you would just add these class values. You create these span values for each label and add the classes for each one. And then just, you know, take some trial and error to get it working right. But that's pretty much it. Does anybody have any questions?
Nice. Thank you, Manuel. That's really, really nice. I'd like to see that another day, spend some more time. Could you show me your design view and may I look at the multilingual setup?
This one here? Or the other one?
The other one.
So in here, I don't have any of the labels for multilingual. So I'm not doing any of that for the labeling. The only multilingual that I'm setting are for like these values, like anything that has a radio button. That's where I'm going in. I'm not setting the questions because it would be pointless to code the questions, because when I do the field embedding, all that goes away.
Right. Okay.
But with the but I still need the values for the radio buttons, so I do the radio buttons, and I did I I did the checkboxes too, but then they weren't working anyway, so I took them out.
Okay.
So that's the one thing I need to do is figure out. I did try to put the span code in here where, language 1 equals text and language 2 equals this, and it wasn't working right, so I just took it out. So I need to figure out a way to hook that functionality in for the checkboxes, and then it would all work fine. But down here for anything that's on the pre-diabetes test that's just straight multilingual, then I add and this is an interesting thing, is that if you look at the code, so I have these labels here that are that have a div, so I can have the background and I can make the padding a little bigger to make them stand out more. Now, you have to add all of this into the multilingual as well. So if we open up just a notepad so you can see it, if I click on this, I have to have the same code as the English. I just have to replace the value here for it to show up. If I just put this value in, then it would just show up like a plain label. So English would have this nice dark blue background and the wide box, but then if you click Spanish and you didn't have the HTML with it, like this, it would just be the label,
Plain.
Yeah, so if you add any styling to your labels here, you have to make sure that this gets copied and pasted into your Spanish, and then you would just change the values. Otherwise, and you can do that here too if you have any. Sometimes you code like yes and no, and yes is green and no is red. If you do that same thing here, if you have any HTML here, you want to make sure that it shows up here. And a good rule of thumb, or something that we've run into problems before, like if you're tearing your hair out because you change this label here, and then you go look at your survey and the label's not updating, and you're tearing your hair out because you're trying to figure out, like, I changed this and it's not working. Well, what happens is this JSON that's generated for the multilingual overrides this.
Yeah.
So if you make the change here, but you don't make the change down here, it's not going to show up. So you have to make sure that you update down here as well.
So question.
Mm-hmm.
Can we change within the action tag environment, and does it automatically default to the upper label, upper field?
If you change down here,
yeah,
it updates this down here. It doesn't change any of this up here.
Okay.
So they're not linked. It's the same thing where if you change this up here, it doesn't automatically change down here in the bottom.
Okay.
So what I usually like to do is I'll copy this whole thing and paste it somewhere just so I have it in case I have to go back to it. But then I make the change up here, and once I make the change with what I'm happy with, I copy it, and then I paste it down here into the Spanish, and I make the change in Spanish. And what happens is anytime you change these values in these boxes, it's dynamically generating this JSON. And so it's easier to just delete the JSON and then start from scratch. You can also, if you're comfortable with it, you can type in here and it automatically updates and saves, but it won't change the label up here, and it won't change any of these values here, which is another thing. If you have a value that you, like if we got rid of this number 3 here, but it was still coded here, now that will update. It's because, so let me show you this real quick. So I'll just delete this,
okay,
and I'll save it. Now when we go back, it'll be, so it's gone now, and when we go back, now we don't have an option 3. So that will update if you do it that way. Now when we do so when I put it back, I have to save it. And then when I go back, you'll see that now it's missing from it still picked it up. Oh, it's because it's in the JSON. So because I didn't delete it from the JSON, even though it wasn't being displayed here, when I put it back, it picked it back up, so I didn't have to type and put that back in.
Little tricks, little tricks.
Yeah, and it's when you're doing a lot of these, especially with like when we were doing the antibody initiative projects, we had so many things that were at multilingual, it was crazy. And then we had to do it over what? I think it was like 36 projects. And so, when you do it that way, it's a lot easier to copy this and put it in all the other projects that you have instead of trying to build it all together. The other thing is when you export the multilingual, because you would think it'd be easy to just take the instrument, export the instrument CSV file, and import it into another project. But what happens is you have to format that CSV file as UTF-8, or else anything that has like these enyes here, any of the accents, get garbled and they just turn into little question marks. So you would spend all your time building all this and dumping it into another project only to open it up and see that it all got cut off and truncated and didn't get pulled in properly. And that was one of the big problems we had when we were building all these other projects is Excel doesn't like to do that normally. You have to format Excel properly. But there's another product that Terry turned me on to called OpenOffice, which has like an Excel-like program that allows you to do this, and it's a little easier, especially when you're doing all this and you have these commas and JSON. Sometimes these don't get commented out properly, and so this comma might throw your CSV file off, and so when you go to import it, it starts to error out, and there's all these other problems with this as well. So while the multilingual is nice, it can be a pain in the butt too.
It's an adventure, especially when you start exporting the multiple languages down into Excel and then import them back up again.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah, you have to pay a lot of attention to it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Much.
Any other questions?
All right. Then I think if nobody has any other questions, we'll go ahead and call it a day early. Thank you all for joining. Appreciate it, Jim. I won't forget to look into your survey queue. Other than that, we'll see you all back next week, and thanks for joining.